As we regroup for our final session of the day, it's my pleasure to welcome Tyler Whale, Reg Ash, Jen Christie, and Brian Cram, who are going to share today all the thoughts on the power of collaboration. Take it away, guys.
Thanks very much, Kate.
They were going to dance. There was going to be a flash mob when they got these headsets on. I'm just telling you.
Are we on? Can you hear me? So we're not going to share all our thoughts. That would take a little longer than 45 minutes. I will share a thought with Katie that the lull after the lunch, Katie, we just heard is from a sugar crash, not a sugar high. So that's why we didn't applaud. And Omid, a quick homage to the vodka. I think if you can use this in your marketing campaign, I thought of a great little tune for you. It goes something like this. Omid McDonald had a pill. I'm sure you heard it. I can see that, somebody disco dancing with one of your technologies in the background. That was great stuff. Anyway, good day. A little bit about me before we get into the panelists. I grew up on what I described as the WWF, and that was the Whale Work Farm, 7th generation dairy farm where child labor is part of the common practice as it is in the ag community. I escaped, I suppose you could say. I moved on to other things, and one of those things recently was recognized here today, and thank you to GRASS for keeping the rapid response alive. That was a program that Gord Surgener had started many years ago at OAFT, and also an event like this. It reminds me a lot about what we did at OAFT for a couple of the times a year is bringing great entrepreneurs together and having good conversations about things that are important in innovation. Currently, I am founding a company, a bioresin company called Biodiffusion Technologies. We're closing a seed round of about $2 million in a family and friends raise in the next week or so. Great potential there. I'm also figuring out how to start a fund, if you will, for vertical farming. The company in particular is called Hybrid Farms, and I think really it's about bringing pickaxes to a gold rush right now. The vertical farm technology platforms are competitive, and again, this requires collaboration. I had a chat with Sean and with John Lansing several times about where's the investment in something like this. This is something that we could put a Canadian fund together in the hundreds of millions probably to get these kinds of technologies going that are, again, competitive with field-grown produce now. And the last thing I'm doing that is absolutely collaborative is to expand the knowledge throughout Canada of the organization called VITO, the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, which has the best collection of infrastructure across Canada to deal with emerging infectious diseases. I think we could all agree that we do not want more pandemics in our future, and these are the kinds of things that can be proactively prophylactic, if you will, in terms of creating vaccines for things that we don't necessarily know that exist yet, but that will. So if anybody has access to the millionaires or billionaires that I need to network with, then please do introduce me to those. On that, I'm going to frame our conversation with a phrase that is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think the power of collaboration is something that is of utmost importance, and we've seen it in spades here today. I mean, you guys are RHA and GRASS and WFA are really kind of showing the stripes of these organizations that have collaborated very well along with the various communities of investors, entrepreneurs, and academics and government that we have here today. So on stage we have three fantastic people who are all doing their own things in various shapes and sizes. There's certainly collaboration already on stage and probably new collaborations being formed. But what I'm going to do is get each of you to give me, 3 to 5 minutes of your intro about what you're doing, why you're doing it, what's successful so far, and maybe what some of the hiccups are that you're having, and then from there we'll branch into some questions. So, Reg, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. Reg Ash, CEO of Western Fair District in London, Ontario. Ag Society, formed about 150 years ago. And this story will go back a bit. I've worked for the association since 2001, and I've had the pleasure of working in all kinds of different areas, but became the CEO in 2019. And had the privilege of announcing that we were going to build the Grove at Western Fair District, which is a collaboration space to support startups and accelerating companies in agri-food production and AgTech. And so we announced that with one tenant and in mind that was going to take 30,000 square feet, and had another one that was a nonprofit that was going to take an office, but we were on our way. So we announced that in October of 19, then we hit the pandemic, but along the way we had ran into the London Economic Development Corp, and they floated an idea of trying to pursue a FedDev grant, the Economic Development Corporation, and we listened, and they said we need some collaborators. We're like, okay, this is good. We're surrounded by farmers. We know how to collaborate. We get along well with everybody, and so we listened, and we put together a grant application throughout pandemic, submitted it, and about a year ago, just a little more than a year ago, we announced that we had this fund, or this grant that was going to be made available, $7.2 million, and we got to invest in giving new life to some of our surplus buildings and do it a little more quickly, because we were able to pull together a whole bunch of people with a common purpose, which was sparking some economic development in our region around agri-food and AgTech. And we had the right people with us. So that was announced in January of 21, and here we are a year later. We have probably about 45,000 square feet of space leased and under construction. We're building an accelerator space for new startups that might want to test a product and do some research on it. We're working with Fanshawe and Dr. Yates, who's in the crowd today, to look at a packaging center in there. So we're really trying to work with the resources around us, use the resources that we have as an ag society to create economic growth for our region, because that's one of the reasons why we believe we should be around, is sparking that, and especially staying true to our roots in agriculture. So it's going pretty well. Brian asked me earlier how many people, how many groups are involved in the Grove right now, and I said somewhere between 13 and 20. I reported 13 to the city, and then when I started trying to think of how did I come with that number, I easily surpassed that. So it's going pretty well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any key challenges you want to use as part of that intro?
Key challenges, continuing to find users of the space will be a challenge. We certainly have been faced with that over the pandemic. Access to certain construction materials was always fun for the last year and a half or more. Trying to build a new space, and Katie, I'm sure you know this, and Jamie, trying to build a new space in pandemic was challenging, but prices go up. So challenge, access to capital, and that's what some of our people inside of our spaces are looking for as well.
Nice. And doing all this over the course of the pandemic, when you're trying to also pivot on your core function of events and places where people gather. So well done.
Yeah.
Jen, how about yourself?
So I am also grew up on a family dairy farm, sixth generation in beautiful Bruce County, and my family still farms grain and dairy there as well. And so I was raised on the farm, similar to some of the stories that we heard today, not so different from Tyler as well, working lots with some very strong female role models on the farm in my family as well. And I went to the University of Guelph and had a career in corporate, and then a couple of years ago decided it was time for a change, and eventually decided it was time to move back to Bruce County. So I was living in Ottawa, working for 4-H Canada, and met my partner who's a chef. So I own a restaurant in Paisley, and I'm also the executive director of Catapult Grey Bruce, because at the same time I was thinking about moving back to Bruce County, I got a phone call from the organization's chair and said, Grey County is purchasing Sydenham School, and they'd like to open a makerspace and innovation and entrepreneurship center, and we have formed a group of business owners in Owen Sound, some names that some would know well from the area, the Van Dolders, folks who have grown very successful businesses in that area, have formed a not-for-profit to support entrepreneurs and startups in the Grey Bruce area. Would you be interested in coming to work for us to help get this off the ground? So October 2019, I moved back home, moved into my parents' basement because we didn't own the restaurant yet, and I started working for this organization, which didn't have a name at the time, so it's really grassroots. And I mean, we've been 2 years of trying to build an organization in a pandemic where space was one of the things we had that we also couldn't use. So. Joe mentioned, finding what is your why, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that lately, and I really think for me it's about positioning people to succeed. And women in particular is important to me. Those who know me know that I founded the Ag Women's Network, and so what we're trying to do at Catapult Grey Bruce is provide that place where collisions like what's happening today and like the ones that we've heard a lot of stories about today, where those collisions can happen. A thread that ran through a lot of people's messages today was, you don't know where you're going to find the connection or the person that's going to open the door that's going to lead to the next big thing. And one thing I learned really quickly when I started in this startup, because that's essentially what Catapult is, was that a lot of people don't appreciate what Grey Bruce has to offer. And so even in communities like Guelph, where so many people from Grey Bruce go to Guelph, go to school, they go there to access services and programming, not a lot of people come north unless you're coming for vacation, and then you don't really see what's happening in Grey Bruce. And so it became really apparent that we would need to nurture and provide mentorship locally to get startups and founders that are in Grey Bruce to be able to then come and access all the supports and great things that we've heard about here today. Because I will be quite honest, people have said, well, what's there? That's the response. And so if you're a founder, trying to talk about your business that you've bought or that you've built, one of our clients, Russ, I'm going to give him a shout out. He's here. His CRT, he's building an incredible live streaming company that you may not have known about before today, but he's been working piles in the agriculture space, bringing agriculture events to farmers in not just our area, but across Ontario over the last 2 years. So there's lots happening up in Grey Bruce. Obviously, agriculture is one of our key industries, and so we think that there's a real unique opportunity to provide space for people to collide and for there to be some cross-sector collaborations that might not otherwise have happened. So our other major industry is energy. Bruce Power is currently undertaking the largest infrastructure project in the country, and in doing so, they have said that all of the suppliers working on that project have to have a footprint in Grey Bruce or Huron counties. So that, coupled with the pandemic and people moving to Grey Bruce, either to live at their cottages or just to get out of the city and live in this area, has created an ecosystem with piles of talent and brilliant people and founders and startups living there, and not the traditional ecosystem supports that would exist. So part of what we've been trying to figure out and do is like I said, provide space for those people to meet and get together, but also like bring the ecosystem a little bit closer as well, so that we can make warm introductions to the various players that are both in the ecosystem, but also outside of it, because we fiercely believe in collaboration, and we're not going to recreate the wheel or build something new in Grey Bruce when we've got such fantastic resources that understand this way better than we do down the road. So we're very focused on early stage and really mapping out the ecosystem, but yeah, creating those places, setting the table for people from different perspectives and industries that are in the region to come together and start, brainstorming and sharing ideas and collaborating.
Yeah, amazing. Another regional conduit, and I just can't stop thinking about you starting a restaurant and a collision space during a pandemic. I mean, you talk about an entrepreneur here. That's incredible, Jen, that you're still on stage.
And I will say, running a restaurant and living in it is not much different than running a farm and never leaving your workplace.
Yeah, there you
so
go.
the hours are similar, the grind is similar. Maybe the only difference is the staffing situation.
Yeah, you were made for it. And Brian, same question.
First of all, you had talked about not knowing where to send people, or people don't know where to find the answer, and I'd say, Joe Dales, if you want to talk about networking and you need to find an answer of who's doing what, Joe is a perfect example of it. And a matter of fact, I looked up, usually for talks like this, I like looking up what the subject is, just like Webster's, and Joe's name came up, then it's a beneficial relationship between two parties. But so my experience, my career's been sort of an unusual career. During the 80s, early 90s, disruptive new technologies. Then grew up in London, by the way, still live in London. And then got involved in agriculture for about 20 years. I was coerced, convinced to join Cuddy Farms by Mac Cuddy, who was a founder. I don't know, some people here may remember Mac, who was a patriarch of Cuddy. Cuddy at the time was the world's largest turkey hatching, egg, and poult producer, integrated business here in Canada, the only supplier of, to McDonald's, sole supplier of all their chicken products. And they were involved in a lot of other poultry operations in Canada and the US as well. From there, went with Cold Springs Farm, and was with Cold Springs really from about 96 through to 2007. Cold Springs was a company just outside of London, large integrated agribusiness. Everything from, we were the largest turkey quota holder in Canada. We eventually, and I'll talk a bit about an experience there, eventually we had the largest turkey primary processing plant. We were the largest turkey boning plant, as well as we had large feed milling, elevator operation, rendering operations, totally vertically integrated, as well as a few thousand acres of cropland in Ontario, Michigan, and Florida. I got involved there a couple of years after the founder, Harvey Beattie, passed away. And it was, he had basically surrounded himself by great technical people in their respective areas in the company. But he ran it from his Cadillac that he drove around. He had suffered polio when he was at a young age, and he lived out of the Cadillac. He gave directions out of his Cadillac. And what had happened when he passed away, unfortunately, was that next level of management hadn't been developed. They knew their respective areas well, but literally a lot of them had been with the company 20 plus years, didn't know how to do a budget, didn't know what capital budgeting was all about, let alone how to deal with all the commodity markets. So there were a group of us that worked pretty diligently to change the look of Cold Springs and how it worked, but a lot of that was through collaboration. Again, I'll speak a bit to that. We ended up selling to Schneider's, and food chain happened. Schneider's bought Maple Leaf. I continued on with Schneider's and Maple Leaf. As CEO Cold Springs, because Cold Springs, the problem was with Maple Leaf when they took us over, we were a mini Maple Leaf. They had rendering with Rosse, we had rendering. They had poultry operations, we had poultry operations, feed milling, they had Suregain. So they weren't quite sure how to deal with us, and we were so integrated the way our model was put together. It was decided I'd continue running that while take on some other senior executive responsibilities. I like getting my hands dirty, both literally and figuratively. I found that in a larger organization like Maple Leaf, I had a very good role. A lot of people would sort of want that role for a career and as a career goal. I found I felt the company's fires more than having a direct impact on the ground. So I decided to leave Maple Leaf, and that was made possible by some investments made in the past. And from that point on, got involved in a number of different companies, both investing and working with private equity groups to go in, sometimes as the operating partner, sometimes to help them evaluate different companies and that sort of thing. These were larger private equity groups, typically out of the Toronto area, Torquest, Edgestone, and Onyx, and different folks like that. Then I got talked into and involved in an early stage company in Waterloo that was just a blast, and it's still going strong. Very young founder. I was 2 years older than his father, so very young founder. Brilliant guy in the area that he focused on, but a couple of the major investors that had already invested in the company felt that he needed an external CEO to help mentor him and to guide the company. So stayed on with this company called DeGero for about 5.5 years. It started out as 1.5 years and was 5.5, but it's because we were growing very rapidly and doing different things. Stepped back from that and got involved in a few other investments. But still living in London, and I'd worked outside of London for really from about 2000 on. I knew the KW ecosystem very well in the tech space, knew the Toronto ecosystem very well in the tech space. Everything I was doing, the collaborative efforts, was in that area. Meanwhile, I kept hearing about London was lagging behind, what was going on from a technical business and startup. Was introduced, I started talking to some folks, and they thought I should talk to the folks at RHA, so talked to Joe and Dave and Brian. By the way, you saw there was a different picture up there with a different last name. Brian Foster wasn't able to make it today, so I'm the stand-in. But really, they were doing what I was hoping could do, and it was really, they use the term founders for founders, and just really, they were one of the few groups that I met that talk that way, but also are walking the talk. You see a lot of different groups do that, but they really don't wrap themselves around with the founders. And Joe mentioned it earlier today. It's not always programmatic, so it's what does Cole need, or what does that group need, or what do they need today versus what they needed 6 months ago. And they had large enough networks themselves to pull in from that network, where it could be a day, it could be an hour spent with those people, or it could be a little larger period of time, depending what the challenges were. So they were kind enough to ask me to come on and to help them out with some different things. And they had been thinking about it, and it was really a genesis from that formed the 519 Growth Fund that we've got going. And I chuckle when I hear both Sean and John talk about their small funds. 519 Growth Fund, we've got about just under 30 LPs in it, and we've got about $3 million in the fund. And that was our target. Actually, our target was a little less. What we're trying to do with that fund is to invest $100,000 to $250,000 in very early stage companies that are between that funny spot between family and friends, unless you have very wealthy family and friends, and even what would be considered a micro VC, where they need a little extra capital and they need a little support, they need some collaborative support to get them in that next spot where they're ready to take what you might call traditional seed. And I mean, that's one of the things that I think as an investor or founders looking for money, it gets pretty confusing now. It's pre-seed and it's pre-seed and it's micro this and it's micro that. It really is finding out the right group to work with at the right time. So we kicked off 519. In December, we closed the fund and we made 2 investments, and happy to say one of the investments was in IntelliCulture, which was great, and we co-invested along with Emertech. And I'll stop at that part because that all gets into a whole different discussion about collaboration. But
Okay, good.
Background.
So I want to take the approach of build, grow, kill kind of thing. Is there any things that we need in this collaborative ecosystem that we should be building right now? Is there anything that is doing well and we should grow it or expand it or replicate it? Current examples on the stage, welcome. And anything that isn't working that we should kill. And Brian, I'm going to save that one for you probably at the end. We've talked about it. Anybody want to field that one? Build, grow, kill? What is missing? Jen, there's got to be stuff missing in your...
Well, so the Founders for Founders concept is something that I think is really important, and we try to lean on that because we were founded by entrepreneurs and were led by entrepreneurs, and that, you know, understanding understanding of the challenges and what the founder is going through is really important. I think one of the challenges, and we are part of the Startup Canada ecosystem as well, along with Jordan back there. I mean, so those entities are all not for profit, so finding funding to run those things is always a challenge, right? Government grants are great, but I believe right now a lot of government funding is looking a lot at scale up, and so the support for the incubation and the earlier stage has kind of waned, and with government funding you're beholden to government metrics, right? And so for these small startup communities, wherever they are, you know, as soon as you can take the FedDev funding, you also have to be able to do the FedDev reporting. And one thing that we really find so we work very closely with Grey County. We receive FedDev funding through them, so I'm grateful that, you know, they are handling that side of it. But even still, you know, for us being in a rural community, FedDev is not used to working with rural municipalities, I would say. And so, you know, their expectations that, you know, there's one person dedicated solely to doing reporting for their grant, like that's just not possible in a small rural community. And so that, for us, that's one of the big challenges, is how do we fund this? You can't really make a charity out of it because of the nature of the work. And so we had a lot of private donors at the onset, but continuing to make sure that we're opening up doors for potential funding is one of our challenges, because I think, again, like, you want to grow these places where it's entrepreneurs leading the charge. Nothing against the other service providers out there, but I think that we've heard a lot about how valuable that is, but again, trying to run a nonprofit is very much burnout.
So
like
also the model,
startup.
I mean, it could speak to building a new model in the not-for-profit sector. I've seen examples of academic institutions, for example, just taking a small minor percentage equity in whatever company they touch, 1% or whatever it might be. It's across the board. You want to talk to us, that's the thing, so that you can eventually fund yourselves. Government's not going to be making more money anytime soon, I doubt. Reg, in your example, so WFA and what Grass is doing, and I mean, you're both on somewhat different trajectories, but you're sitting here in the same room together. I kind of like to see that. Or are there things that you're going to imagine as overlap? Can we replicate what you had? I mean, you had some unique assets that you put to work, and Grass is doing some impact investing. What?
Sure. I hope you can replicate some of the things that we're doing, because if it works in our center. It should work in others. But knowing that we came at this with surplus buildings, like the buildings that we have turned into the Grove were destined to be demolished because we had identified that our on-site gaming operator was going to rebuild on our property. Hey, guess what? They announced they're leaving. So we had these buildings that we were no longer using, and we needed to find new sources of revenue. So we took a little white paper that was built and said, why don't we focus there? So can you replicate it? I hope there's elements that you can. I certainly think that there's certain sort of concepts within what we're doing that you can take outside of London and make it work. But that's just, I guess, a dream right now. We haven't really tested it, but we're collaborating with some people in the space that are startups, and we're doing it because, well, we believe in what they're doing. It's not necessarily the same focus that some of the investors have here. We believe in what they're doing because it furthers our mandate, and that's super important. And when I met Katie and we had those conversations about what we're doing, what she was talking about Grass wanting to do, there was just natural fit that together we can do a lot more. And so here we are after a year of meeting one another and sitting in this room and having that discussion. But how do we take it to the next step? How do we grow from what we're doing? And I guess these are the types of forums where that happens.
Yep.
You share the idea, you hopefully get some people that say, yeah, I like what you're doing because that kind of fits my brand. And I mean, to RH and the 519 Fund, I mean, we work well together because we each have strengths and resources, and what we're doing kind of works for one another. And just being able to take that and do it more and more is going to...
And that proximity, I like that.
Yeah.
Again, what's going on in your region is amazing, and the rapid response as an example would be a good thing for you to watch how successful it is, and maybe you expand it for your region. I mean, that program was incredible and easy to run, and it's effective. So I think you do, you borrow, you steal, you do whatever you think.
Yeah.
Now, Brian, getting into the challenges, the kills. There's collaboration isn't always easy. There are some things that you have to be aware of before you start into a very busy and confusing collaboration. Why don't you talk about?
Yeah, and I'd say even before that stage that I think you just raised some challenges that you talked about. If you look at KW, you look at Toronto, you look at some things going on in Guelph, you look at London. You've got a lot of ecosystem partners with quotations around it, that are apparently working together for the best interest of the founders. And the problem with that model, I find, is you've got these people reporting to different agencies. It might be LEDC. They've got certain KPI, LEDC's London Economic Development Corp. They might have certain KPIs that they're being measured on by the city and their founding partners there. And you've got the Tech Alliance, which is a regional innovation center similar to Communitech. Well, the government, they've got different KPIs. All these KPIs don't necessarily line up with each other. So somebody from the outside, especially somebody that likes to see speed of decision making, as long as you've got the right information to make it, I used to scratch my head like, why isn't this moving forward? And you start realizing that these people collectively are having trouble breaking down those silos between each other. And I'm happy to say I'm seeing a lot more emphasis on people trying to do that, especially in the London area and that, because of where we're working more closely. But it still comes back to, the university has its KPIs for the Morissette Center, and Fanshawe has their KPIs, and they don't necessarily line up. So you've got people that are holding on to, let's say, a founder too long, or not sharing that founder with somebody over here where they know, maybe that group could really help them more from a technical perspective or a financial perspective, whatever it is. So I'd like to see, and it's one of those wishes because there's not a magic foo-foo dust that you could throw on it, I'd like to see that broken down. I think people can act as a catalyst, and again, that's what attracted me to RHA, quite frankly. They're acting as a catalyst from that perspective, and it hasn't been without a few arrows in everybody's backs and that sort of thing, but that's to be expected as you're trying to create change in that sort of environment. And there's a lot of people that are on side with it, but it's going to take a while, and until that happens, I don't think you're going to get the collaboration that you need for the benefit of the founder and the benefit of building up the ecosystem. On that, if I look at John, so ACC, and I look at Emertech and other groups, 519, it's easier sometimes for those groups to collaborate, because if you can develop what the community of interest is on that particular deal that you're looking at, and why we might bring value to it, even though it might be less dollar value, or why Emertech might be bringing a different type of value, and the same with ACC, it's easier for people with that community of interest to focus on it, on that community of interest. And then, as I think John mentioned earlier, it has to be papered, right? So everybody understands their roles and their commitments and that sort of thing, but then it can move forward. And unfortunately, I think sometimes that's just a lot easier to do within a private context than it is always with these various government agencies. And that's not putting the agencies down, it's figuring out how to work together so it's effective for what they're actually trying to do, which is help sustain these companies and let them grow.
Brian, you bring up some good points, and again, I remember, John, you said, you at least hinted towards the idea that we're running a relay here. It's not necessarily the 4x100 with one runner and you make it to the end on your own. You're more effective when you pass the baton, but there's turfiness and there's collaboration, there's abundance and there's scarcity. So I hear there's an abundance of money, but it's pretty bloody hard to get, so it's scarce for those who are really looking for it. One of the challenges that I always noticed is as an example, I might be dealing with 5 to 10 dairy companies. They're all knocking on the same doors. Some of their products are good, some of them are going to be good, but they all need people. And these are all entrepreneurs who want to innovate in the dairy sector, let's say. How do we merge those? I don't think that's happening nearly enough. I'd like to hear your opinions on those kinds of things, is taking a group of people who are willing to sacrifice their family life and their income and their mental well-being so that they can be an entrepreneur, and yet they're all after the same scarce resources, or the talent, for example, that doesn't exist everywhere in abundance. So how do we address these kinds of things? Where are opportunities to improve collaboration, find collaborations at the startup phase? Is this a ridiculous idea? Anybody want to take that one on?
I'll jump in very quickly, not to take. Today, we heard from 3 different founders. I want to make sure 3 different founders, none of them from the ag space. And they got to learn somehow that there were some opportunities in the ag space. They might have had an aptitude, but they weren't from the space. We've got to develop something that allows that crossover to let those type of entrepreneurs that bring different skill sets to the party, like who'd think General Dynamics to what you're doing, to be exposed to what's available in the ag space. And I was thinking today, as I was listening to people talking, it's probably already been done because lots of smarter people have tried these things before. Is there a way to do some sort of expos of something from the ag side to the tech people or people from different industry and somehow bring them together? It can be done sometimes on a one-to-one basis, but you're not going to get as big of impact if there's a way to do it on a somewhat larger scale and give people the ability to see what some of the possibilities are, who can bring different skill sets, aptitudes, and all that sort of thing to the party.
I'd love to see an event, Jen, Bioenterprise, Grass, where you bring 100 entrepreneurs together, 100 companies together, and 10 leave. Something happens. Maybe you have one that is specific to a sector, or software, dairy, or Cole's kind of thing. I'm sure you need talent. You were talking to me about needing talent. There's got to be a bunch of other failing entrepreneurs out there who can't access the resources that you took from them. in that sense. So bring them in before it gets too expensive. Go ahead, Jen.
So I haven't heard co-opetition today, and that's a term that I heard first on the energy space at a nuclear event, and that's. You have to know, growing up in Bruce County, putting Bruce Power on a pedestal is really hard, but especially if you grew up on a farm. But like that is what they've fostered with the MCR and what they're doing, because these suppliers are locating here, but they need other business to sustain being in the region, and so it has forced connections to happen. So we have. We have isotopes being produced to treat cancer in Bruce County now, because two totally different suppliers, were in a room together and realized, hey, we could do this. So I don't see why we can't do that in agriculture, like in AgTech. So an event maybe with a challenge, put a challenge out there, and everyone in the room has to work together on it. Whether the challenge is solved or not, there's going to be some interesting things come out of that. I think that breaking down that competition mindset, there's ways to do it, and so I think it just takes the will to do it.
Yeah, there's the NIMBY and the YIMBY, the not in my backyard, the yes in my backyard. So you don't want the isotopes, but you want the businesses to stay, for example, or whatever it is. I mean, to some extent, you got to switch that. And at some point, you should talk about what you're doing with Chris Herbert, who's here. Reg, I'm going to ask you, maybe you could give a couple of seconds or minutes or whatever on what you're doing with Chuck at Haggerty Creek Automation.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, that pulls in the RHA and that whole ecosystem you're building.
Goes back to Joe's Rolodex, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
quick, we're in rapid fire around now.
Yeah, and so
The dating service
Joe,
extraordinaire.
he's connected with Chuck at Haggerty Creek, now also operating Haggerty Agrobotics. And Chuck was relaying to Joe how he had pitched a couple of ideas for funding, and he was told he can only have one funded. He said, give me 5-10 minutes. He actually, I think, asked for overnight. And he called me, and I said, Joe, it's exactly what an ag society should be doing. So you've got an agrobotics focused company, you've got an ag society who's not-for-profit, so we can attract certain grants, and our whole concept is to research the needs of the ag community. So this just made some sense. So Joe forced us together, and now we're going to do a research study together on agrobotics, and it's exciting to see that happen. And just through those conversations, you start thinking about, well, if agrobotics are going to take off in our area, and we replicate in Southern Ontario a whole bunch of different terrains and farming conditions, maybe we need an ag robotics lab happening. And well, that's kind of the nature of the Grove, is trying to provide those spaces, because we have resources and we want to share them to stimulate economic activity. So just forcing those conversations to happen is how it goes from an idea to a conversation to actual results. And I'll just share that we had a small anniversary celebration for our first year anniversary of the Grove in the fall, and we had a little dinner afterwards, and just a few of the tenants that have decided to take root in there, once you put them together, because they hadn't really met each other, because we existed in COVID times, you put them together, and just the same as what you see happening here today is conversations start happening, and they're like, I didn't know you were doing that. Oh, we're doing this. Together we could do this. And it's kind of that magic that happens when you provide those resources and space and just have the conversations happen.
So to layer on that, Ray Minato, right there, is the CEO of Inertia Product Development. So he's in this conversation too, from Toronto, but he's a hardware, software innovator, if you will, creator. So as Chuck is developing his new technologies, he needs somebody to prototype the things, and if you don't have the talent, you can lease it. kind of like you don't
Right.
need to own a car in every country you're going
But
to.
you have to know where to find it.
You lease them, but you do have to know where to find it. And that's where the connectors, again, come in extremely handy
Yeah.
and are definitely undervalued, I'll say. As a past connector, I think that lead generation, that dating service is really undervalued. It probably should be automated at some point. Jen, could you describe the Bruce nuclear carbon credit thing that you and Chris, where's Chris, back there in the corner, are working on?
Yeah, so
Unexpected characters coming together to do something pretty cool with, again, the friendly villain in your backyard.
yeah, we're recording all this, right?
I'm just kidding.
So,
I'm
yes.
a big supporter of
but-
nuclear, by the way.
But I think that, I mean, this is the vision in action, right? So Bruce Power has a goal to be net zero by 2027 at their at their generating station in the Bruce, and so they launched a fund to I don't even know the language because this is so out of my, but they launched a fund to be able to essentially purchase offsets locally. And so they invited the community to submit proposals on what that could be. And so with Chris's leadership, and he's got some connections, and with a local farmer who is very interested in being able to get carbon credits because he has a lot of land and it's capturing carbon, right? He's doing the things that we want farmers to be doing, and he sees that there's value in that. But today, it's very difficult for farmers to get paid for that, to actually get that value and get paid for that credit. So through Twitter, of all places, Chris and Ken connected and started talking about this. And then, Bruce Power launches this fund. And so Chris and Ken really took the lead to pull together, a team of people who know a little bit about these different things, right? And I think what is brilliant in it is that those of us who have worked in the space, we operate with what we know, and sometimes don't always see what we maybe don't know. And so this working group that Tyler's also a part of, and a few other folks that we've I guess submitted a proposal to see if we can figure out how you actually do this in the region. And so how do you measure and validate the carbon that farmers are capturing in their soil in a way that then, a customer like Bruce Power could then purchase that offset. I think any one of us individually couldn't have pulled it off, right? It's very much a team effort and a collaborative effort, and having people with outside perspectives and connections to people who have experience in this space, to be able to bring in the various subject matter experts to see if this is something that we can do. So in some ways it's the farms in Grey Bruce are the sandbox to figure out if we can actually do this, if it's possible.
And where the money goes, the interest flows, I suppose. So hopefully, and then we'll have to build that team out even more. So, look, in the last little bit, I don't think we solved any problems. Honestly, we probably identified more than anything. But there is a pretty remarkable collaborative atmosphere here between investors, between entrepreneurs have discussed plenty of opportunities. I think there's been probably some highlights of ecosystems that are being built both in London and Wellington County here, led by Grass, for example, that need to be emulated and replicated. We need more of this and figure out how to tie in. So the last comment I want to get to you before we're done, and I think we're done, I've been monitoring the time, is what do you need from the audience? If they did one thing, if they made one connection for each of you, what would really help you advance your success? No order. Go ahead.
Keep the deal flow coming. So, and for 519, that's a little different than some other groups perhaps. If you know of young companies that aren't even ready for investment yet, feel free to introduce them to 519, to RHA, because it's sort of what we collaboratively, again, do, because they're separate, but obviously we work very closely together. That's important. So don't assume because somebody doesn't even have their business plan put together, and they maybe don't even have any sales yet. We're interested in having a discussion and figuring out if that's a sort of founder or group of founders that we want to work with, help them develop and get to the point where maybe we hand them off to somebody else or we develop them ourselves. But that would be my ask. And because, again, it's founders or funders for founders. And, you know, we will be happy to work with them at a much earlier stage than most groups.
And if you're a young company, go introduce yourself to them. You don't think you're ready, you probably are, and you'll probably poach some good advice if you're not. Jen?
If you or people you know are in the Grey Bruce region, please send them our way or come check us out. We are still in the awareness building phase as well, because again, like none of these supports have existed in the region. So it's very much a building for us right now. So we are looking for sponsorship. We are looking for mentors who are in and invested in Grey Bruce, right? Because we're also in the long term, like having a long term view of what we're doing here. So we want to see Grey Bruce continue to thrive even after all the projects are done.
And you're like a self-made regional innovation center, like an Innovation Guelph or a Communitech or one of those. It's all the region built their own, right? Undersurfaced.
Yes.
Perfect. Reg? Last word.
Yeah, last word. We're always looking to support AgTech, agri-food startups in the London region. If you know any, we've got space and can build the suit. I'd like to just remind people that OMID is a great example that there is innovation in food products as well. Don't forget to invest in them as well. There are some really unique products out there ready to be launched on the market.
Yeah. Huge opportunity. Thank you all for your time and insights. Thank you for being a great audience and listening, and I look forward to the vodka.
Bonfire.
So again,
On fire from Queen.
a huge thank you.
I think our mic's still.
A huge thank you to Brian, Jen, Reg, and Tyler for joining us this afternoon. And I know these are four incredibly passionate people that would love to continue this conversation off the stage. So don't let it stop at this point. But thank you for your time and your patience. I know we're about 10 minutes over schedule. But as we wrap up the formal part of today, I would be remiss not to thank, again, the following people. RHA for their continued partnership, support, Joe personally for all of the many telephone calls and Zoom calls that we've had over the last couple of months pulling this together, and again, access to Joe's Rolodex to make many of the people realize that today and speaking today would be a good use of their time. To our ecosystem supporters that really presented here today, Western Fair, FCC, Bioenterprise, Emertech, thanks for making the time for us. To Rob, Cole, Omid for sharing their stories, thank you. It's hearing that side of it makes a real big difference, I think, especially to those founders in the room and to the new funders in the room as well. And to Karen, Joe, Deborah, John, Tyler, Jen, Brian, and Reg, thanks for being phenomenal panelists and, duking it out in the best possible way. I'd like to put a shout out to Alice Gray and her team at Mindful Monk for providing some fudge products that you're going to be able to try or take away with you, and to Omid and his colleagues at Dairy Distillery for the up-and-coming treats and putting a little spice into our coffee this morning for those that participated. Last but not least, and she's going to kill me for doing this, I'd like to thank my colleague and dear friend Louise, who has championed this from behind the scenes. Many, many emails backwards and forwards. and to the whole Grandway team who once again just took it completely in stride as I started a conversation. So Joe and I have been chatting and they knew what was coming, so I really appreciate all the support in making today happen. Thank you guys for making time to be in the room. The recording of today will be available in segments via the SPARK webpage, and in true grass fashion, we want to make sure that these resources are for the ecosystem. So if there is value in these as you position them in other places or you're having other conversations, please use them. There's nothing worse than being in a conference or a symposium and being energized and having these conversations and stepping away from that and then not knowing where to take the next step. So if nothing more than the recordings keeping that energy and that collision high, please do use them. And now for the most important part of the day, relax, connect with one another, and continue to ignite collaboration where agri-food innovation meets investment. Thank you.